So let's go. I want to introduce our very first speaker to you. He's an internationally sought-after speaker, Joseph Michelli. He is an author and an organizational consultant who transfers his knowledge of exceptional business practices in ways that develop a more productive workforce. His insights encourage leaders and frontline workers to grow and invest passionately in all aspects of their personal lives and their professional lives. Look at the person next to you and say, you're gonna like this guy. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Say it. A little more encouraging. He's sitting back here ready to take the stage. Are we gonna like him or not? The answer is yes. Joseph, come ahead at this time if you would, please.
Well, I've never had a pre-programmed liking experience before, so I like that. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a great opportunity to talk about these dynamic and exciting times. It's a little hard to follow Greg, though, because he's got such dynamism and energy himself. He talked about kind of 3 objectives associated with this and this conference, and some of it has to do with perspective, some of it has to do with industry expertise, and some of it has to do with resources. And I'm certainly on the side of the perspective as opposed to industry expertise or resources. I am here to celebrate the perspective that has gotten you where you are today, the perspective that enables you to build the future and the infrastructure of the world that my children and grandchildren will be living in. I certainly am celebrating the fact that you are part of a community that shares information, that supports each other, that learns from each other, and I hope that all that will happen in the next couple of days. And finally, I want to celebrate you for determination and adaptivity, which have obviously been on display for you over the last several years. You know, I used to think the world was hard when I reflected back on my early adolescent college days, and boy, was I wrong about how difficult it really was. In those days, the big challenge were things like I wanted to go to graduate school upon completing college, and I applied to everywhere. Anywhere I could read the application, I got my very first letter back, and it was so, I applied anywhere. Lower Botswana State didn't bother me. If I could read the application, I was applying. And the very first letter came from the University of California, Los Angeles, and I could feel Ed McMahon's presence in the room. That's a little dated. I could feel Ryan Seacrest's presence in the room as I was opening the envelope, Carson Daly, whoever you want. So I'm reading the envelope, and it says, "Dear applicant, we're sorry to inform you, you've not been accepted to the University of California, Los Angeles. Best wishes in your future career endeavors. Sincerely, John Michaels, Dean of the Graduate School." Not that I've held on to the wording of that letter to this day. Upon reviewing that letter, I was devastated by not being in control of my destiny. So what do you think I did in response to that letter? What's that? I challenged. I wrote them a letter back. And my letter said, "Dear graduate school, please accept my letter of rejection of your letter of rejection. I look forward to attending on the first day of class. Please send information regarding books. Sincerely, applicant Joseph Michelli." So what do you think they did? Wrote me a letter back, absolutely. And their letter read, "Dear Mr. Michelli," now we're getting somewhere. "We are somewhat confused by your most recent correspondence. To the best of our knowledge, in the history of this institution, no one has ever rejected our letter of rejection. For the sake of clarification," which they underlined, "there is no room for you in the incoming class, and you will not graduate. Sincerely, John Michaels, Dean of the Graduate School." So what do you think I did? I wrote them a letter back, and my letter read, "Dear John, sir, it is you who is confused. For the sake of clarification," which I also underlined, "as it relates to the issue of class size, John, I don't take up a great deal of room. Come graduation time, likely someone will fail. I'll just fill in for them in line. Love, Joe." So what do you think they did? No, he didn't write anymore. It was getting urgent. He called me, and John said in so many words, "We think you need a psych program, but it's not going to be here at the University of California, Los Angeles," which was perfectly fine because the day before I received that telephone call, I was accepted across town at the private school, not the public dump that can't make it to the Rose Bowl. Not that I harbor any hard feelings toward UCLA to this day. It stands for You Can't Learn Anything. The reality was I was accepted across town at the private school, USC, University of Spoiled Children. And I would still slum out of my neighborhood at USC years into my graduate program to hang out with John over at UCLA. And while hanging out with him in his neighborhood of Brentwood, Bel Air, and Beverly Hills, I would leave my neighborhood of Watts and we would have conversations. And John said in so many words, you know, we essentially didn't know whether or not you were coming or not. And do you remember the whole thing? And I would say, of course, you took such a personal interest in me. And John said, well, let me tell you the rest of the story, as the late Paul Harvey would have said. He said, we actually had a meeting, Joseph, between the psychology department and the Department of Security to discuss what would happen if you showed up on the first day of class. The reality is so often we struggle against the things we can't control. We can be clever, we can be witty, we can be creative, but often we get very self-focused. And to use the word of Greg, we navel gaze a bit at our own reality, and that takes away from the adaptive resources we need to get where we need to be. Now, the strange part of the story actually is that one of the principles I'm going to talk about today, which is focusing on otherness, really gets us out of that. And I happen to do that later in my life. I start focusing on what brands do to be successful, stop thinking about me, and how do I get into graduate school, and how can I be creative enough to get my way in. It's not all about me. And in so doing, I had a really difficult choice. A few years later, after having written books about other brands that had been successful, I had to make a decision. Would I write a rejection letter to UCLA when they hit me up to do a book about them? And it just so happened the full cycle went through. We ended up doing that book about UCLA, donating the money to Wounded Warriors, and it was a very successful book for me on the New York Times bestseller list. And the reality was, when you stop thinking about just yourself, you think about the collaborative opportunities, you think about the communities in which you live, it's amazing how successful life becomes. We're going to talk about VUCA. We're going to talk about the life you've been leading. And normally I would quote someone really smart like Aristotle or Plato or someone like that. But instead, I will quote Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the mouth. The quote machine, Mike Tyson, generated that great one, right? Now, we all have been punched in the mouth. It depends on where you want to start and where you want to finish, but most of us have taken more than one punch over the last few years. For a lot of folks, it really kind of started in the context of COVID and the dramatic, world-shaping changes that came from it. And a lot of folks took the first punches of that and they never got off the mat. Some of us are still taking punches with all of the supply chain challenges, labor challenges, economic inflationary challenges, and we're holding on just enough to make it to the next round. And then there are those who are presenting to the world a stronger through adversity perspective. And we're going to take a look at what that takes. Now, I had the good fortune during the pandemic to meet with not only my clients, but with friends of them and more. And before you know it, we were talking with CEOs from 140 companies who were exploring how did they emerge from adversity stronger. And so the principles from the CEO at Verizon, Hans Vestberg, or CEO of Target, Brian Cornell, or a variety of other C-suite leaders, what did they do to try to position their organizations through the uncertainties of the pandemic? But clearly, whatever that was, it's applicable to situations that transcend that. And the key message, if I could cull down all of it, if you could take it as a one-liner in a headline world, it's that organizations that strive to learn how to be adaptive, the resilient skills, individually and collectively, and who focus on something other than themselves, namely creating value for those they serve, are the organizations that thrive. And through every economic downturn, we've seen a burgeoning of organizations who strive to make it an opportunity. In the economic downturn of 2008, Uber was born, as was Airbnb. And every economic downturn, there's a proliferation of organizations that thrive. So we're going to talk about what are those principles, how do you do it? You know, this VUCA concept, which Greg alluded to, has been around for quite a while, but it was nestled into the military community in the United States. It was a concept taught in war colleges. Its focus was to anticipate the moves of the opponent, and to imagine that the opponent wouldn't act in linear and predictable ways, and that you had to constantly think of how they could be disruptive and do things that were not, in fact, scenario-based. Well, the world has formed in such a way now that almost everything we do has a VUCA element. The ability to rely on forecasting to make predictions for the future has declined in a way it has never happened, at least in the last 50 years. Most researchers would tell you that we are less capable of doing long-term strategic planning than ever before. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, it just means you shouldn't, in the words of Mike Tyson, expect that your plan is going to withstand the first contact. With that in mind, I'm going to give you 4 principles on how to emerge stronger through adversity. And those principles are going to take place in forms that will hopefully reflect both individually and collectively. So the first principle is put your mask on first and drive resilience within your organization. Well, the push your mask on first concept is something that we understand well. We've all heard the safety briefings and the emphasis on being able to ensure that you are safe before you put the mask on someone else who's in need. And the reality is that leaders organizationally frequently fail on this immensely. They are so responsible for the mantle that they carry in their organizations to make sure those capital projects move forward that they neglect the very thing that's going to be necessary to sustain them through the totality of the experience. In writing Stronger Through Adversity, I was talking to Stacy Salvi, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Fitbit, and she said, I knew it was bad because I was in my chair and I was strategizing with Stanford Medical School and how could we use our wearable device to be able to predict the locations where COVID was moving, and we were so entranced in whether we could use this device for the social good that I frequently ignored my very device that was telling me to get up and walk. We forget about our own selves in the context of this. So we're going to focus on putting your own mask on first. We're going to talk a lot about personal resilience, but we're also going to talk about what does it take to drive resilience as a skill set organizationally. So I know that this room has a lot of engineering types in it, and the good news is resilience comes from, first, the Latin word of the 16th centuries, which means to recoil, but in the 1900s is a term that was really understood in the context of engineering principles. And essentially, resilience had 3 elements to it. It required a force, and that force would then cause you to have a period for equilibrium, to return recoiling back or elastically moving back into the space that you were in from the force, and then finally, just the degree to which the organism was capable of that elasticity, at which point would the force be so great that the organism would be stretched beyond its capacity to come back to its prior state. Now, engineering notwithstanding, in a functional way for our lives, it really speaks to what is our skill set to be effective under pressure. It speaks specifically to how do we take our adaptive energy and not burn it out, which is the technical definition of burnout in the physiological sense, and how do we come back from adversity stronger than we found ourselves, managing our health and well-being and taking action for optimal performance. So we're going to do this on 2 levels. And while I speak on the personal level, you can understand that this is all applicable to what we do as leaders within our organizations. To what degree do we role model this so that others feel that they too can do it? And to what degree do we tactically drive these skill sets in our organization? So there's only really 2 ways to manage the stressors that we face today. The first of which is to mitigate the stress. Now, this is really a large part of what organizational resilience is all about. It's anticipating the things that can trip you up and taking advance action against them so you're less likely to happen. Unfortunately, given the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, and the ambiguity of what might threaten you, you're not always equipped to have advanced recon on those issues. And without that, it's often like trying to build your parachute while you're jumping off a bridge, right? So you're not able to mitigate the thing that will threaten you, but what you can do is increase your adaptive response and replenish the adaptive energy required to react to the things that come at you in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous ways. So let's look at some of the sets of activities involved in putting your mask on first and driving resilience, our first key takeaway. Some of the subset of activities, there really are 4 things that research has shown greatly impact your capacity to respond to stressors resiliently. The first of which has to do with purpose. And strategy 1 is really just to be super clear of why you are actually going through all of this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. What is it that causes you to stay in the game, wake up every morning, and attack the problems that will be coming at you from every single direction? And Friedrich Nietzsche said it well. He says, "He who has a why can endure any how." The absence of a why, the absence of the true north driving principle for what gets you up and gets you going is really one of the most resilient factors we have as human beings. The absence of our why, personally and professionally, renders us very vulnerable to the volatility in the system around us. How do we clarify our why? We really do need to take some time and think about it. One of the gifts of the pandemic, and I really think gifts of the pandemic is a really wrong sentence, but one of the gifts of the pandemic is that many people really did a reset. What matters to me? Do I want to live in a city? Do I want to live in a country? Do I want to work in this job? Do I not want to work in this job? Do I want to continue to get Netflix or not? Things that were habitual and just happening in a very cyclical, mindless way were suddenly consciously reset. But it doesn't necessarily happen just because we have a crisis. We have to take the time and ask ourselves, how will your life success be measured? Knowing what you will measure your life success against is an indicator of your purpose. What is it that I hold deeply in my belief system that should drive my actions, that I should not violate, gives us a grounding of our core value structure. Who can I rely on in my world? Who do I want to invite in my inner circle? Jim Collins says that we should have a very tight board of directors of our life. Who do I want on my board? Who do I have on my board? Who should I fire from my board of directors? And who should I bring into that space? How am I going to not only have a purpose, but how do I grow in the direction of my purpose? I love this question. I'd really like for you to think about it for a second. I'll do it very slowly because I tend to talk a little bit fast. What is the last time you did something for the first time? When was the last time you did something for the first time? And what was it? Anybody have something? What was something you've done for the first time relatively recently? Anybody have something right there? Started to learn to try to play the piano. Why behind you?
I tiled my bathroom.
Tiled your bathroom. Those are very similar activities. You two should get together. You'd have a great party. You could play your bathroom in a tiled, and you could play your piano in a tiled environment. Why? Why learn to play piano? You're over 12. Like, that's the optimal age to learn to play piano. And the point is, those of us who constantly grow and adapt and actually seek out new environments of uncertainty, will I make it? Boy, that's a long stretch to go octaves. Tile, a grout line? Yikes. Those of us who are willing to face those learning challenges are more likely to adapt because we have a center core. There's something about them, something about their life purpose that draws them into those new experiences. And then finally, how do I leverage feedback to help me move along my journey to my purpose? The second element of this put your mask on first strategy is to seek social support. Give yourself a hand. You are here in a community for social support. Give yourself a hand. That was about as enthusiastic as we're going to like him. I just want to put it in perspective here. Being in an environment where you can get social support and asking for social support are two very different things. Congratulations on being here. Now, what the heck are you going to do with it? Are you going to say, hey, I don't really know in a particular area, might you help me? Or will you be the one who goes, I know I know in your area too. Yeah, I played piano since I was a kid. Grout lines, no problem. I do bathrooms. Are you that person who's going to not only be a support, but ask for support in this environment? If you are, it will predict greater outcomes in terms of your resilience. Les Brown says that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but it is really an indicator of strength. And in the pandemic, we saw much more of that. Out of necessity, people change out of this need, this inspiration, or this desperation. And certainly desperation caused a lot more people to humble themselves to ask for help because nobody knew what the heck was going on. And nobody could hide that they didn't know what the heck was going on. Now's the time to really use this opportunity to do it. The strategy 3 is a growth mindset and a locus of control. And what it essentially says that if you are constantly growing, if you're always looking for new opportunities, learning how to play the piano, trying to tile your bathroom, whatever it might be, those people who are open to learning, who say, I don't know it, I want to learn it, it's not where I start, it's how I end, they're people who are constantly benefiting from the feedback of the universe and using it to be resilient. They also appreciate this locus of control concept, and I like to really simplify it by using a donut. Food products are a very helpful way for me to get through most everything in my life, and donuts are especially important. The donut principle essentially is this. If you want to know about locus of control, realize that the donut is all the things you don't control. That wonderful, tasty, yummy, doughy goodness of the donut is everything when you look at it that we don't control. And the whole is what we control. In relative proportion, most of the things in our lives are out of our control. We may influence, but fully control them. The supply chain, that's in your control? Well, I'd like to talk to you about it because it's posed a few problems for me. Labor, you've got control of that? Good for you. Please tell me your secret. The things that we do influence, in the whole, things we control in the whole. Every time something happens in our lives, the people who are most resilient say, donut, let me look for the hole. That's donut, going for the hole. And through the hole, I will shoot through the hole, I will find the things I will control, I'll maximize my locus of control, and I will gain perspective and success. I really would challenge you to use that simple metaphor whenever something's coming at you and you're wrestling with it, to really, is this donut or hole? And if it's donut, then what part can I control in this scenario? Charles Swindoll says that only one string can we play, and that string is our attitude, and that life is 90% our attitude. It really is so much that our attitude controls relative to the rest of the sequencing. The last couple of bits on what can you do to put your mask on first is really think about delegation and prioritization. People who have a need to control everything by their nature tend to be less resilient. Put it together. I want to control everything and everything's out of my control. It's not a good formula for life success and happiness. So what can I pawn off on the universe to someone else? More importantly, what is it that only I can do? And where can I share the things that others can do with them to help us get through this? Where is that matrix of the things that will have high value for high effort, high value for low effort, relative to all those things that will take high effort and produce low value? Also, I won't go into this because your mama and your grandma already told you all the wellness practices, but this is the time. If you want to be resilient, now's the time to buckle down on what grandma told you. Now's the time to look carefully at your alcohol consumption, look carefully at your exercise patterns, look carefully at your eating, look carefully at how much you use your devices before you go to bed, all those things. Well, maybe my grandma didn't tell me anything about devices before I went to bed. She wasn't quite that prognostic, but most of the rest of the stuff she was pretty much on page with. We know that if you want to be resilient, you have to fuel the machine with lifestyle-related activities. We have to make investments in relationships if we're going to be resilient. You know, it's pretty hard to call on that board of directors of your life if you've never spent any time making deposits into that board. If you haven't made with deposits before the crisis, it's pretty hard to call on them during the crisis. But the good news is you can start making deposits now to take care of the next volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous time in your life. And I have pointed out here, you can actually put a date night on your calendar. It seems pretty ego alien, but it is the mechanism of really higher prioritization of relationships. My wife loved flowers, so I was really lousy at remembering to send her flowers, so finally I figured out a process. I basically just told my florist to send her flowers 4 times a year, and I gave him a budget. Piece of cake, just build a process. The problem was the first time I came home and I saw flowers, and I said, wow, where'd you get those? It did not work out quite the way I had intended it. You may want to refine the process a bit. But she was getting flowers 4 times a year when she hadn't before, you get me? May not have been as spontaneous as I would have liked to have made it happen. We need to put some structure around making those relationships investments. And then the last 2 things in this put your mask on first thing is really to purposefully recreate. Now I know the word's actually recreate, right? But if you think about it, recreation should recreate your energy for adaptive purposes. Not all recreation recreates. I watch people scroll like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and come away zombified and then totally drained and depleted or completely agitated and outraged. And I think, wow, that sounds like fun. I really want to do that so I can come back ready to charge up for the next battle. Tracking how we deploy our recreational time to see whether it's recreational is really important. And then I like to track joy. The world's hard enough. We're out of control enough. Why don't we look for some of the things that come into our life that counteract the narrative that says all this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous stuff is bad. Sometimes completely volatile, great things come into my life. And at the end of each day, it's important to track them. I did so many things terribly as a parent, but I did every night before my kids went to sleep, have a conversation with them, and I asked them just to remember one thing from their day that brought them joy. And I wanted them to kind of transition from wakefulness to sleepfulness with a memory of something that brought them joy. And I would normally share with them something that brought me joy, which was almost always them. I would encourage you to think about being resilient by being attentive to the things that are unexpectedly positive in your life as well. Enough of the individual stuff. Virginia Satir had said that, it's not problems that are the problem, it's coping that's the problem. Personal coping and organizational coping. There are organizations that study how to help businesses be resilient. They have a very rich framework of the core competencies that are required to have a resilient business. I won't belabor all of that. You can dive into the core competencies if they interest you. I'll give you a couple of examples of what organizational consulting is in the resilience space. It tends to be about continuity management. So it's anticipating in advance all of the systems and processes that if they were to go down would cost really big challenges in the time to recoil back to a natural state of being, if not coming back stronger. And so the challenge of this continuity management core competency is identifying all of the key systems that you need to bring back online as quickly as possible and investing the time in advance to make sure that those come back online as needed. It's preparing for the potential threats to your business. Do you have a continuity management plan? I imagine you do. If not, certainly something from an organizational resilience you should explore. And you should really identify those systems that, if offline, will really sink your battleship. I cited Jim Collins earlier. The other thing that he said is that we can't take a hit below the waterline, right? If we can take hits above the waterline as we're sailing in the water, we can patch them up and get back out there. But if we take a hit below the waterline, we are literally sunk. And so this concept is about identifying the things that will hit you below the waterline. Another dimension of those 12 is just crisis management and communication, really understanding how do we take something small that's happening in our business and be able to manage it so it doesn't escalate into a full-blown crisis. How do we manage the narrative? How do we manage our solutions so that it doesn't rage out of control? How do we develop the communication plans necessary when things go awry so that we can get ourselves back on track quickly? How do we make sure we're communicating enough, but not too much? I think there's a misconception that in times of crisis, you cannot communicate too much. Now, in reality, most people never get to that point where they should worry about it. But you can communicate too much if it's not purposeful. If you're just making noise because you think you have to communicate. If you don't know what's going on and you just keep communicating to the system misinformation, you can communicate way too much in crisis. So effective communication planning is, who do we talk to? When do we talk to? What is our strategic plan? Are we evaluating kind of mission criticality every morning, setting our daily goals, debriefing in the afternoon, evaluating, summarizing, and communicating our next daily goal, because the horizon line is shifted from 6-month planning to day-by-day planning. What is our communication cadence? How do we know when to go out with the communication, and how do we repeat and reinforce the core messages? All right, the last key piece of this first element, and frankly, it's the longest element of the 4, is just learning agility. This is a concept that's very important for leaders to understand. We can build learning agility into our teams if we understand what it is and we strive to make it possible. If we can help our teams learn how to make decisions flexibly and rapidly, if we can help them learn how to take on new behavior, seek out opportunities for new behavior, how to get feedback quickly from the system and leverage feedback for immediate growth, whether that's customer feedback, peer-to-peer feedback, and also just be willing to make decisions when they don't know what the answers are in advance. There's an incredible book about this. It's written by Professor Professor Burke and Professor Hoff. They are specialists in assessing whether or not your organization is learning resilient or not, and whether it's learning agile or not. And they evaluate based on these dimensions: speed, flexibility, your willingness to experiment, the willingness to take risks with new performance, interpersonal risk, putting ourselves in situations outside of our holy huddles and our comfort zones, the ability for our teams to collaborate, to solve problems as opposed to just trying to nail it on their own, and the ability to use feedback and reflect on the things we learn, which is kind of one of the key messages I'm suggesting all the way around, is anytime we go through a critical incident, we need to debrief, analyze, take our learnings, and move forward for the next situation. The next of the key takeaways is just simplify and expedite. We live with the complexity, so all that we can do to remove complexity on tasks and activities that don't require complexity gives us more bandwidth to handle the natural occurring complexity of our times. To do that, we have to let go of some of the systems in our lives that are already complex but familiar. And the economist John Maynard Keynes says the difficulty doesn't lie in new ideas, it's letting go of the old ideas. Where are we holding on to systems that really make our life more complex? They may be more manual, they may be just our way of doing it, but they don't streamline and reduce our complexity. And I'm not saying shifting from our existing system to the next doesn't have complexity, but once we get through that transition, we have a world where we know we'll be operating more efficiently. Pivoting with urgency really just is the ability to see data as it's coming at you and make real-time course adjustments, as opposed to belaboring your commitment to your strategic plan. I climbed 14ers in Colorado when I lived there for most of my life, and I had an instructor who basically said, when you have a trail map and you see the terrain, and the terrain and the trail map are not aligned, follow the terrain, right? This map was created at a time prior to the shifts in the terrain, and now you are encountering the terrain in real time. How are you using your eyes, your ears to track the signals that are right before you? And then just the speed by which we have to make those pivots is well described by race car driver Mario Andretti, who says that if everything seems under control, you're not going fast enough. It's a bad sign if everything seems under control at the speed by which you're taking it. You should be experiencing a world with blistering speed. We are connected at the fingertips with the entire universe. Events that happen a world away that our grandparents would have never known about are in our face within moments. And we're getting it from 50 different angles. And we're required to sort out which of those 50 angles is true, or is there truth? That challenge is the speed by which we have to operate in a business environment today. The third key takeaway is to focus on otherness, and I implied it in my opening remarks with regard to UCLA, but I'll tell you it is the salvation. The more we focus on how to create value for others and the less we worry about our own survival, the more likely we are to survive. And even better yet, to thrive, because we're positioning ourselves by a value-based donut hole analysis of the universe. So how do you do that? You just listen, empathize, add value, and delight. It's called Learn Model. It's one that I worked with Mercedes-Benz as part of their leadership team development. And the goal was to just help people see that in every interaction with every person you have the privilege of associating, you have the opportunity to listen, actively listen, empathize, make sure that when you've listened and you've understood the words at a cognitive level, that you understand the emotional impact of that on humans. I love, people are taking pictures. If you want this deck, I'll just give it to you at the end. Don't worry, you can take as many pictures as you want, but the deck is yours. I'll just give you a download link. So if you find any value in it, because I'm in the business of adding value. And sometimes I listen with my eyes, right? So if you see things, in addition to hear things, where you can connect with people's perception of what they need, empathize with that, add value. And then ultimately delight, which is really just the subtle act of doing something more than what people expect. The more you do that, the more likely you are going to thrive in times of uncertainty. I've worked with Starbucks as a consultant for a long time, and we just taught our baristas a process to listen with their eyes and empathize with the customers. And literally, it's called the customer walk. We'd have a team member, we call them partners, go out from the parking lot, we'd rotate it across the shifts, go out from the parking lot, walk like a customer, and then stay in line. If they see the condiment area needs to be cleaned, go ahead and fix that. If it's in your control, it's the donut, take care of it. If it's outside, it's the hole. If it's outside of your control, the donut, like somebody mowed down a sign, then escalate it. We'll fix that as a lead from the leadership perspective. But just stay in line, listen to what people are saying, what they're thinking, sharing on the line. Look at the donut case. I'm really obsessed about donut. Look at the pastry case from the customer's vantage point, because you'll see the smudges from that vantage point. If you're on the other side of the counter, you're going to see the food before you see the glass, whereas the customers will see the glass before they see the food. So we just systematize that, right? A process that we'd rotate around the organization that required people to listen with their eyes and to do so in a way that put them in the perspective of the customer. It's through that customer walk that we've innovated so many value-add solutions at Starbucks. That customer walk said the biggest pain point we've noticed is just making change and having people pay with cash. So years ago, what did we do? Waiting for the real technology to come along and save us, waiting for the church to bring the pies. We just decided we'd do our best. We used a 2D scanner at point of sale and had people use their mobile device for that 2D scanner. Lo and behold, it's the most effective at-scale rollout of mobile pay technology in the US at the time. And then from there, we just kept observing customers using the customer walk, and we realized customers appreciated they didn't have to pay and saved them time and they could get out to their train, but they would prefer to be able to have ordered using the same technology that they paid on. And so mobile ordering happened, and then geolocation of where you were relative to the ordering. We also realized that as you create value, there are different points in the value chain where people are more likely to remember the value you create. The behavioral economists have shown us that people really value it when you greet them and welcome them into the environment and make them feel safe for choosing you. That arrival moment is particularly important. They really care when they go from one state of being to another state of being. Okay, I've given you the money, now I need to wait for you to service. Well, that's a big state of being shift. And being able to help them transition that is particularly important. The peak moments, celebrate them. Put a bow on a peak moment in a relationship with a partner. Valleys, try to streamline them as much as possible. No organization is friction-free. And then finally, from the perspective of understanding the ending, we can't just throw it away. We may be really excited to see you when you come in, but we also have to be really excited to thank you and call you to a sequel and the opportunity to be in a relationship with you. So creating value at moments that matter most to the people you interact with. So I have a tool for that. It's called an empathy map. If you download the deck, you can get that. And it's really just a way of saying, okay, when I look at my interactions with people I serve, how do I understand what they're thinking, seeing, feeling, doing, smelling, touching, tasting, depending upon the circumstance? What is their gain that they seek to have in the interaction? What is the pain that they endure to interact with me? And where do we have an opportunity to do something different? Sometimes it's decreasing the amount of visual clutter or the technical language in order to make that experience possible. Other times it's adding something as an enricher to that particular moment in a memorable part of the journey. All right, here's the last one. I told you that there would be 4. It's the last takeaway, and it's to define your legacy. Going back to the purpose of it all, people who really do well in times of crisis are people who know how they want to be remembered and the lasting impact they will have on their organization. Crises are crucibles that test our character. People will remember you more for the way you manage the crisis moments than they will remember you for the way you manage the calm. So we really need to think about, what do I want my lasting impact to be so that I can make choices to course correct in the times of crisis and stay aligned with the lasting impact I want to have. So I ask every leader that I work with, what lasting impact do they want to have? I asked Howard Schultz this question. Howard was the founder of the, kind of the world of Starbucks as you and I know it. And he's had to go back and be the leader of this organization a couple of times. After the economic downturn in 2008, he had to lead a comeback for the brand. He had to do it again during unionization challenges that the brand faced and in the aftermath of his successors leaving. And when I asked him years ago what he wanted his lasting impact to be, he said he wanted to leave a lasting brand that elevates lives one cup at a time. A lasting brand required him to take action to come back in times of crisis, to be there, to be a steadying hand for the brand. I asked this guy's name is Steve Cannon. He's the CEO of Mercedes-Benz when we were working on the transformation of the brand. Mercedes-Benz used to be ranked 22nd on the J.D. Power on customer satisfaction. The brand promise was best or nothing. Technically, that means they were nothing when it came to the way they delivered experiences for customers. They were barely nudging out Mazda most of the time. It's hard for the German engineers to get really excited. Woo, we beat Mazda. It was not really a crowning moment for the brand. And this guy said, I want to create a legacy where we focus on otherness of the experience in the dealership. We want to help our dealer partners connect with our customers in a way that creates value as we weather the crisis of being 22nd in the J.D. Power. And we will do it, and we will make sure that we deliver delight to every customer, every time, no excuses. And he focused that on his legacy. Lo and behold, we ended up with a book about that with that particular title, kind of conveniently named, and really afforded an opportunity for the brand to catapult up from 22nd to always hovering around first or second in the ratings, sometimes with Lexus, sometimes with BMW, in the customer satisfaction ratings today. The key isn't really what those people think. The key is what you're going to do in order to maximize your resilience in these VUCA times. I challenge you to declare a legacy. Now, this may sound a bit audacious, and I'll deal with that a little bit later. But I want you to think about, as you go through this crisis, whatever it might be, and the next one, because they're always going to keep coming, the world is now permanently VUCAized, right? It's not something that we have to war game. It is something we have to anticipate, given the structure and speed of change. So given the VUCA nature of things, what do you want your legacy as a leader in this industry to be? And I'd love for you to think about it and think about declaring it in an I statement. I will, with declarative force. And I would hope that in addition to using the I statement, you would make yourself gulp. Did I really say that? Seems a bit much. Okay. I don't want you to get crazy. Most of you are not going to be NBA stars at this point in your career, but I want some big aspirational thing, particularly within the context of things you could influence, to make it be so. And then I would hope that you would publish it. And by that, I don't mean, taking out a billboard ad. I mean sharing it with somebody that you trust on your board of directors of life because you've nurtured those relationships, because we know that social support is critical to your resilience. I'd like for you to share it with them. And then I'd like for them to help you be accountable. I'd like for them to be someone you check in with on a quarterly or semi-annual basis and ask, how am I doing at living my legacy? These are the things I've worked on this quarter, this half year. How am I doing at creating lasting impact? Because the more we focus on that, the more substantively we're going to create value, the more we're going to demonstrate the resilience, the more we're going to shoot through the hole. So I have a tool for that for you as well, and you're certainly welcome to download it if you download the deck. It's essentially right there on this slide thing. It's just my website in the dash Kurt. And so you can download it, and if you find value in actually writing it down on that sheet, if not, just write it down on a sheet of paper. If you find value in an empathy map as a tool, feel free to do that as well. All right, that brings us to Q&A, and then I have one set of comments to make right at the end of Q&A, but we're open to any questions you might have about how, and if you don't have a question for me, I'll have a question for you. So I'll have one for you if you don't have any for me. So whichever way you want to play this game.
They have plenty for you. We need sound up here, please.
They have plenty for you.
Uh-oh.
Yes, and so here's the first one. Any advice on how to flip the script when it comes to fear? For 3 years, we've been operating in response to fear instead of positivity. Thoughts?
Yeah, a little fear goes a long way. I mean, some gets you up in the morning, right? I mean, it gets you going, but too much fear is paralyzing. There's it's the stress curve, right? So if you think about the bell curve on stress, eustress means that you have the absence of stress, right? So you would be dead if you had no stress. So a little fear probably isn't the worst thing in the world. The problem is fear activates a brain system, the limbic system, which activates increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased blood flow, large periphery of your body, and essentially gets you ready to fight or flee. And that is adaptive energy, and there's only so much of it. So if you exercise it, you can burn out your adaptive energy and be incapable of coming out for the next round, which is what burnout is. The answer to the question implies shortage versus abundance and trust in yourself versus a lack of trust in yourself. Look, there are threats. They're coming at you. You have faced many threats before, and you will face it with the best possible set of solutions, particularly if you reach out to others and do some of these other things. The reality is that we're going to constantly be attacked by all kinds of things. That should not be great news to anybody. The degree to which we place on it the capacity to devastate us is the difference between adaptivity and paralysis. So I'd say really a little fear is good. How you interpret the fear, once it gets past motivational force, that's the time for you to start saying, let's look at our resources as opposed to our scarcity.
Thank you, Joseph. Another question asks, of all the organizations you've worked with around the globe, which is the most resilient and why?
Wow. I think that younger an organization is, typically the more resilient it is. So in my early days of working with Zappos, I would have said they were the most resilient company I've ever worked with. They just kept doing things, bad things would happen to them, would try something new. It was just amazing. The older and more mature organizations get, the less resilient they tend to be. They tend to get more they become more mature, they become adulterated, if you know what I mean. They lose that resilient spirit. They realize they have so much brand equity on the line. So I would still say most of my startups, like I worked with Airbnb, and in the early days, those guys are just crazy weird. I mean, seriously, in 2008, I was working for Ritz-Carlton, and we were trying to make a decision. Could we possibly serve a beer in a bottle to a guest at a Ritz-Carlton? I mean, it was so lowbrow. It had to be put in a chalice, and it had to be delivered with such gravitas, right? At the same time, those dudes in San Francisco were saying, hey, you think we can rent out our free room and maybe put some air mattresses in it and serve some Pop-Tarts and call it breakfast? I mean, and they constantly had that mindset that, hey, let's just try anything, and if something bad happens, let's try something else. So I think the answer is always, it's always been the startups, but I think any leader who can create a startup mindset within an established organization has even more advantage because they have all that maturity They have all those resources if they can just forget about the fact that they could lose them and leverage them for good.
Great answer. Is an organization that's highly resistant more or less likely to be truly adaptive to new thoughts, new behaviors? How do you balance being resilient to being adaptive?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question, right? So resilient in the sense that something hits me and then I respond to it in a way that's meaningful. Adaptive often is, I see the sign before I need to be resilient. So these are slight variations on a theme. They're very similar, so I don't want to be too much inside baseball here. But I think the key is to try not to have to be resilient by adapting before you have to be resilient. And that really is an art of saying, what's coming? What are the scenarios? You know, and to be very uncomfortable with the uncertainty. If I ask you right now, within a 90% confidence level, please give me the length of the Nile River. Who would like to give me an answer? Who would like to give me an answer within a 90% confidence level? Just give me something, come on. 1,000 miles. So within a 90% confidence interval. You could have given me a range within that interval. You could have said 0 to 2 billion miles. And then within a confidence factor of 90%, you would be right? We often think we need to know things that we can't possibly know because we know things about so many things that we feel obligated to act like we know things that we don't. And I think that really great organizations are willing to say, we don't know, we're going to learn, and we're going to try to position ourselves based on our learnings, and that means we'll not have to be resilient from acting like we knew and then taking the blow. Had there been a consequence for a wrong answer, you would have had to be resilient, right?
Next question. Do you think VUCA, along with its uncomfortableness, is here to stay?
Yeah, I hopefully have answered that one in part. I'm uncertain about the answer. It's a complex question. Could you be more specific? It seems a bit ambiguous. I don't want to give a volatile answer. I mean, it really is. If you don't think it's here to stay, if you don't have it ingrained in your mind at the end of this conference and say, I live in a VUCA world, and I'm ready for the challenge, and I am going to make sure that I'm geared for it, both adaptively and resiliently, then you miss the point.
By Mercedes taking the ranking from 22 to 1 or 2, as you say, what impact did that have on their overall business performance?
Oh, it was huge from a profitability standpoint. And I'll tell you, we had to do some things to get people to join us on that. You know, Mercedes-Benz, for the dealership community, pretty much went this way. You get a fixed margin for every car you sell, and then you have a variable margin. And the variable margin was based on performance factors, and treating customers well was very small in that variable margin, but it was in there. So we went to the dealer body and said, we'd like to have a bigger proportion of variable margin, and we'd like to take it from your fixed margin. You can imagine how well that played. And then we said, but guess what? You know, if you didn't earn the variable margin in the old days, we would keep it. Now we'll make sure you get all of the variable margin. Do you want to play? And guess what? People who really knew they could do it said, yeah, heck yeah, then we'll get a lot of that margin that the laggards won't get. This is going to be a meritocracy. And that changed everything. When people really said, I can control the way I take care of customers, which will give me more control of profits, I'm in. Otherwise, they felt like it wasn't worth controlling.
I am aligned with all of your concepts, but how do I lead my leaders? How do I lead from below to get me where I know that we need to go?
It's an influence game, isn't it? It's not a control game. You're not going to control your leaders. Sending them a book like Learning Agility might be a good one. That's not even my book. I'm not even recommending my book. Just dropping it on their desk. I think the reality is that we have to constantly take control of influencing up and down and laterally. And if we don't, we yield our power. Now, there is a point where your leaders are completely immutable objects. In those cases, I would take control over looking for where I might want to work where leaders are more amenable to the messaging, right? So we may not control our leaders, but we control our choice on who we work with. And if we've exercised all the control to influence them and it's not turned out well, there's no reason to live your life miserable. That you control.
Another question, where does the concept of quote-unquote psychological safety come into play in the organization's application of what you're teaching?
So there's physical security and there's psychological safety. Maslowian hierarchy blends them together. Perceptions of danger are the same as real danger. And if anything, probably, other than in our most recent history, I know in the construction industry, there's all kinds of physical safety. My dad ran heavy equipment for a cement factory, so we went to all the safety picnics. I get that physical safety reality. For most workplaces, physical safety is not a prominent front stage psychological focus. It certainly became so in the pandemic when people realized that the employment contract could actually render someone dead. But for most of us, psychological safety is the same. If we perceive danger, we interpret that danger in the same physiological way that we would physical harm. So for me, just realize your brain's going to activate as if a saber-toothed tiger was on you psychologically, the same way it would if it perceives a physical harm coming to you. So I think the simple answer to that is that we need to help people feel safe, psychologically and physically.
This is an interesting one. The construction industry strives for consistency and certainty at every level. New ideas are often met with resistance. Perhaps that's the same everywhere. But how can we begin as leaders to shift the paradigm, to embrace the what-if concept on new ideas and link it somehow to the consistency and certainty requirement of our business?
Wow, I mean, people's lives are on the line in what you construct, so obviously, consistency is critical. I doubt you're building buildings the same way you built them 70, 80 years ago in many functions. There are many things probably you do the same, but a lot of things have changed. Normally, these change curves are people who are willing to test market new strategies to see their viability, and then once they demonstrate the viability in a test case scenario, to then take them to scale. These are skunkwork projects in some organizations, as opposed to doing things at full scale. If your organization isn't trying some new things, and you're just doing it, there's going to be an organization that disrupts you. The MarTech law basically says that most organizations improve incrementally over time. But some of the things that happen, trends, technology trends, consumer behavior trends, often are exponential. And the gap between the incremental improvement and the exponential the curve, like the use of digital, for example, among consumers, that gap is called the disruption gap. And so if you aren't doing some new things occasionally, in addition to just incrementally improving, you run the risk of a lot of new entrants in the marketplace finding disruptive forces to get in there. So I'm not saying throw away the playbook because it's gotten you here and it does predict consistency, but it doesn't necessarily solve future problems.
You talked about the importance of having a personal board of directors. What are the 2 or 3 characteristics that you look for with people that you would like to serve on your personal board of directors, but who may not necessarily be in agreement with all of your thoughts and outlooks and concepts? What characteristics best define the folks that you bring into your inner circle?
Well, first, I think it's a great sign if they don't always think exactly like you, because what kind of a board would that be except a validation of your already predisposed pattern? The flip side of that is I think you're looking for people who will make you better, who will call your higher angels. Obviously, I talked about firing people from your board of directors, but I think you want to look at people in your world. I'm sure they're in this room right now. There are people who should be on your board of directors in this room right now, who you admire because of some factor. It may be the way they innovate. It may be the way they respond to crisis and adversity. It may be their rock-solid consistency. You probably want to have, as any good board would have, diversity of thought and diversity of strengths to bolster up those areas where you really want to grow the most.
And lastly, and I think we have time for just one more question. What is the greatest insight that you personally have gleaned in all your work with these companies? What have they taught you? 1 or 2 principles, breakthroughs, learnings that you have taken away most profoundly in your work with those businesses?
Yeah, I think service serves us is probably the simplest one for me. That in serving others, we are served. In seeking self, we frequently lose any capacity to get what we really need. And I think there was a great book by James Lincoln Collier called The Rise of Selfishness in America. And it really speaks to the fact that we have a challenge on our hands to stop thinking about our own self all the time in order to be of service. It's like a Chamber of Commerce meeting where everybody's selling and nobody's buying. You know, we need to have the capacity to think about others. Now, I say that, and success isn't about capitulating to others and being servants to others. It's about being compassionate and assertive, but being compassionate while being assertive. So that would be my answer, and that's a great segue. Thanks for that being the last question, because it's a great segue to my closing message. If I can, Greg, I'd like to just kind of put a point on the legacy thing, right? Like I said, for you, that you should make a legacy statement. But let me give you a confession. I thought that was a stupid idea for a long time. Well, who am I to have a legacy? Legacy schmegacy. Go get over your bad legacy self, right? But in truth, we're all going to leave one, either by design or by default. The more we design it, the bigger our legacy is going to be. Now, I didn't appreciate it until I met this woman. Her name is Nora. I dated Nora for a year, which was 51 weeks longer than any woman had ever dated me before. The problem with dating someone a long time is that they start putting pressure on you for like, where's this going? What's the long-term future of this thing? To which I would normally say, maybe to the next date. She didn't like that answer. She got so fed up with me not making a commitment to something bigger and longer term that she left the state where we were, which was California, and moved to the state of Colorado. Tactically brilliant. My family's from Colorado. My mom would call me and say, Joey, just hanging out with Nora. Wish you were here. Brilliant strategy, I might add. Finally, I capitulated and I left California to go to Colorado. The internet says I stalked her. That's not true. I got on my knee. I said, Nora, let's spend our future together. Let's plan a legacy together. She accepted my proposal, and our legacy statement was this. We would raise 2 children who would give more to the world than they took. That was all we aspired to do. Wasn't grand. We also weren't doing very well at it in adolescence. We had kids in our household that were spawn of Satan living in our house. So ultimately, Nora and I are on this pursuit, got the kids in the house, and Nora and I decided we would move from Colorado to Florida because Nora loved to sail. She was from Michigan. There wasn't a lot of water to sail on in Colorado. We moved to Florida and Tampa Bay. My son had just graduated from college, never saw that coming. And my daughter decided to move in high school. She was happy to move out of the state of Colorado to go to a different high school. We're in Florida. We're in Tampa for 6 weeks when Nora's breast cancer metastasized to her heart, her liver, her lungs, and her brain. And I had to call my son, and I said, Andrew, you're going to need to come home. I know that you're really loving your job, your new job as a sound engineer. You're loving that, but you're going to have to come home. At some point up the road, your mom's in the intensive care unit. I will let you know. You don't have to do anything dramatic, just I'll let you know. He said, fine, Dad. Next day, I get a call from him. He said, Dad, can you pick me up at the airport here in Tampa? I said, what are you doing in Tampa? I told you I'd let you know if I needed you. He goes, Dad, I quit my job and I moved home. I said, Andrew, you did not quit your job. I put you through college. You did not quit your job. And this is not home, Andrew. Home is where your job is, because parents always say the right things. And Andrew said, no, Dad, home is where my mom is. And so my son, who has this college degree in sound engineering, not only comes back to a place he's never lived before, but now has to find a job. He's working first as a barista. It pays to know people at Starbucks. And more importantly, he says, that's not meaningful enough for me. I want to do something else. And so he decides he wants to be a certified nursing assistant. I said, Andrew, do you understand what that is? That's like bedpans, and that's the lowest rung in healthcare. You really want to start there? You've got a college degree. He goes, yes, Dad, I want to do that. So it was my son who was toileting his mother in the final days of her life. And as I watched him do that, I appreciated that. I'm so grateful that Nora slowed me down enough to challenge me to define the legacy that we would create in the world. And there it was, thanks to her stewardship, when the time we needed it most, in the time of greatest crisis, the time of greatest volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity for us. I challenge you to really take on the commitment to create your legacy statement, because none of us know how much time we have. None of us know if we'll be here at the next iteration of this convention, but we know we have now, and that we control. Thanks so much for your time and attention.